What if you had to live just one day in ancient Egypt? Not in the fantasy, but in the real thing. Forget pyramids and gold masks. This is blistering heat, sand in your teeth, crocodiles in your bath, bread that wears down your molars, and an afterlife that requires paperwork. Ancient Egypt wasn't made for comfort, and modern you probably wouldn't last a day. So tonight, let's fall asleep, walking through that world, slowly, quietly, one sun-soaked, dust-covered step at a time. Imagine this: your eyes open, and before you have a chance to process the day, the glaring heat sinks into your skin. No temperature-regulated bedroom, no blackout curtains, no fan humming in the background, just the sun, high and merciless, already claiming its power over you. The Egyptians didn't see this as an inconvenience, though. For them, it was divine. The sun god Ra was said to sail across the sky each day, judging life below with his unrelenting gaze. You, waking up in the sand-caked glow of this ancient world, wouldn't have the luxury of dismissing it as just another sunny day. And forget hitting snooze. Sunrise wasn't your alarm clock, it was your command. Ra's presence wasn't simply light or warmth. It was encoded into every aspect of Egyptian life. To them, each beam of sunlight wasn't random. It was deliberate, intentional, divine. It's what gave the crops life, what drew the Nile to flood and retreat. But on the flip side, it also brought searing heat that scraped at your patience and beat you down before the day even started. Sweating through a morning in ancient Egypt wasn't just uncomfortable, it was humbling. The very act of surviving under the sun seemed to remind every mortal soul, you are small, and Ra is everything. Now, adjust your expectations. This isn't a morning where relief sweeps in with the promise of cool air, breathable fabric. Dream on. Despite the iconic linen tunics we associate with Egyptian style, they were more symbolic than functional. Sure, linen was lightweight, but there's only so much magic natural fibers can work when temperatures are unforgiving, and shade is a rare commodity. Even if you were fortunate enough to live near palm groves or high walls that offered shady patches, stepping beyond them immediately surrendered you to the heat. And that heat wasn't passive. It covered you like an oppressive weight, cutting through any hope for comfort. Modern you, used to gym shorts, moisture-wicking fabrics, or even the simple grace of cold water on command, would feel defeated just commuting to the village well. But physical discomfort was only half the battle. There was also the mental strain of knowing that this relentless fireball wasn't just a celestial body. It was Ra himself, and you were living under his authority. Fail to keep up with life's demands, slack on your offerings, disrespect your duties, and in their eyes, Ra could withdraw his favor. Fail too deeply, and the light might turn against you entirely. Can you feel that kind of pressure? Knowing each bead of sweat, each missed task, each simple mistake wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a lapse in your relationship with the very deity allowing you to exist. Not only that, but Egypt's culture drilled into every citizen the idea that cosmic balance, or Ma'at, depended on human effort. If Ma'at fell out of harmony, chaos, Isfet, would reign. To maintain this crucial balance, the sun had to rise predictably, crops had to grow, and seasons couldn't falter. Your compliance to thrive under Ra's watch wasn't personal, it was universal, and it wasn't optional. Even if you convinced yourself that you'd be fine sweating it out for one day while skipping rituals, the psychological toll of letting the gods down could haunt you. It wasn't about surviving a bad day, it was about breaking cosmic order. The reality is, For someone from the modern world, the sheer weight of this divine judgment through nature feels crushing. How do you carry on knowing there's no escape? No hopeful cloudy afternoon. No way to lower the thermostat. Every step you take outdoors, every drip of sweat, even every breath you draw in this dry, hot air tightens the leash of discomfort, reminding you that surrender is the only option. Keep in mind, they didn't complain like we might groan about the weather. Ra's heat wasn't an inconvenience. It was a performance of power you simply endured. Let's not forget about sleep. Even in the cool hours before sunrise, the air remained heavy. Without fans or any ventilation, most Egyptians relied on thick mud brick walls to absorb heat during the day and release it at night. But comfort, still out of reach. You'd lie on a simple bed frame, or the ground if you were poor, already sticky from yesterday's heat and bracing for tomorrow's even hotter challenge. Some relied on a jar of water placed near them overnight to cool their hands or forehead. A luxury if you had the resources, but a fleeting one at best. There were no refreshing mornings, just the slow, creeping revelation that your next 12 hours were going to be merciless. And now we must ask, how long before the cracks in your modern resilience show? Sure, you've weathered heat waves, maybe even a sweltering summer camping trip, but those moments were temporary, and most importantly, optional. What happens when the heat is constant and surrender is mandatory? You'd quickly discover that your willpower, no matter how strong you think it is, amounts to very little when you're battling not just nature, but divinity itself. By the time you muster the strength to rise from your mat or bed, the day has already defined itself. It's not a question of what you'll do to push through, but of how much you'll endure. There are no shortcuts here. No midday naps in air-conditioned rooms. No hydration apps reminding you to drink water on schedule. From the second you woke up under Ra's glare, the reality was clear. The sun owned you. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. He called the shots, and you simply complied. But before you even consider what the rest of the day might hold, there's one task waiting for you. The Nile calls, beckoning you toward its murky currents for your morning ritual. Of course, it's not just about hygiene, it's survival. Only this survival comes with its own set of dangers, as you'll find crocodiles and dirty shores aren't the most inviting morning companions. So take a moment to breathe, if the heat will let you, and get ready for what's next. You're about to meet Egypt's lifeblood, and one of its greatest hazards. Your first task of the day, bathing in the mighty Nile. A river as essential as it was unpredictable. Humidity hangs in the morning air as you make your way to the riverbank, already bracing for the discomfort ahead. To us, hygiene is simple. Hot showers, personal soaps, maybe even a blueberry-scented scrub. But for an ancient Egyptian, cleanliness was tied to ritual. Bathing wasn't just about rinsing off the sweat. It was a chance to cleanse your body and soul alike. Standing there, though, you might wonder, is spiritual purity worth the risks lurking just below the surface? The Nile wasn't a flawless mirror of serenity. Sure, it was the heart of Egyptian life, carrying silt for fertile lands and quenching the desert's thirst. But the water itself? Think of a fish market meeting a swamp on an off day. There was nothing clean about it. Families, livestock, and even funeral boats had a claim to the same stretch of river. Yet, there you are, standing on a muddy shore, preparing to strip away the grime of yesterday, or maybe just trade it for a fresher layer of Nile-soaked discomfort. Privacy. Forget about it. This wasn't your neatly enclosed bathroom. Neighbors worked beside you, women washed clothes, and kids splashed while you tried to find an unoccupied patch of water. The whole process was communal, practical, and, let's be honest, awkward. Then there was the sand. Hard to believe exfoliation wasn't invented in a spa, but ancient Egyptians were masters of low-tech solutions. With no soap, they relied on grains of sand, rubbing it across their skin to scrape away dirt. Effective, sure. Comfortable, not even close. It was nature's sandpaper, a bit too gritty for modern tastes. And, as if the scrubbing weren't rough enough, you didn't even get to wade into sparkling blue water to rinse it off. Instead, you crouched into water swirling with mud and debris, hoping the current would carry away the residue before anything else, like a crocodile, took notice. Speaking of crocodiles, it's hard to relax when you know the same river you're bathing in doubles as a hunting ground for ancient reptiles. Crocodiles prowled the Nile with a patience that could put a house cat to shame. They had sharp eyes for movement, especially the kind created by someone careless enough to pound clothes against rocks or splash too much. And let's not romanticize this moment. Drifting funeral boats were a regular sight at the time, reminders of those who didn't make it. Some might have met their end right here, in these waters. Crocodiles didn't discriminate between washing linens and what, to them, looked like vulnerable prey. If you managed to ignore the predators, the routine still left plenty to endure. Laundry doubled as manual labor. Washing clothes wasn't as simple as tossing them into water and calling it a day. Instead, fabrics were scrubbed against rough rocks, the very foundation of their cleanliness grinding them down over time. It's no wonder clothing repairs were as constant as breathing. So, as you worked alongside your neighbors, knee-deep in this murky lifeline, the very act of removing filth felt like a monumental task, one accompanied by cuts, scrapes, and ongoing discomfort. The riverbank itself had no regard for personal boundaries. Whether it was tying up your linen tunic or dealing with dripping water, everything you did out here was public knowledge. Modesty? A luxury reserved for, well, no one really. Everything about bathing put your humanity on display. It's hard to hide frustration, exhaustion, or plain old vulnerability when you're surrounded by people who are all enduring the same thing. The communal nature of the Nile made sure you never suffered alone, although whether that was comforting is debatable. And yet, despite everything, skipping this ritual wasn't an option. Staying clean was part of maintaining Ma'at, the vital balance of order and harmony in Egyptian culture. If you let your hygiene, and by extension, your obligations to the divine, slip, it wasn't just personal neglect. It was disorder creeping in, tipping the scales toward chaos. Every splash, every grain of sand rubbed into your skin, every anxious glance toward the shadowy waters was weighed against your commitment to living properly in Ra's gaze. Let's not forget, the Nile wasn't your only chore for the morning. Families large and small relied on water fetched from the same river. Once you rinsed yourself off and somehow avoided a hungry croc, it was time to fill heavy jars and take them home. Women would hoist these vessels onto their heads, carefully balancing them on the unsteady ground as the sun turned the morning's heat into an oppressive oven. Water wasn't just something you bathed in. It was something you hauled, stored, and used sparingly, knowing this endless routine would do nothing to lessen the Nile's grip on your life. For all its drawbacks, the river was still sacred, treated with reverence even as you squatted on its muddy shores. Ancient Egyptians believed the Nile was a gift from the gods, its flooding tied to the cycles of life and death. You might step into its depths with nerves about predators or the smell on your skin afterward, But you'd also carry a weight of gratitude too. You had no choice. Like the sun above, the Nile wasn't something you questioned. You simply obeyed. So here's the real question. Could you manage it? Could you brush off the indignity of communal bathing, embrace sand as your makeshift soap, and step into water reminding you of its dangers at every moment? Sure, modern showers spoil us, but even with a mental pep talk, it's hard to imagine trading the clean, private microcosm of a bathroom for the gritty, life-or-death slog ancient Egyptians lived through daily. At the very least, you'd gain a newfound respect for the sheer effort it took just to get clean. But survival in ancient Egypt demanded more than just conquering discomfort. Bathing in the Nile wasn't about feeling good. It was about making it out alive. Hygiene, spirituality, and danger were tied together in a way you'd never expect, each strengthening the invisible bond between people and the natural world. For every layer of grime you removed, the struggle it took to do so became a reminder of the fragility and resilience of life just outside your reach. Now, with your skin clean, relatively speaking, and tension still fresh from the close encounter with nature's sharp instincts, it's time for another necessity. Breakfast. Don't expect a comforting cup of hot coffee or fluffy pancakes. What's waiting for you is gritty, rough, and, no, the sand in your bread isn't just some poetic reflection of yesterday's exfoliating experience. Forget pancakes with syrup or a steaming mug of coffee. Your breakfast in ancient Egypt is something else entirely. The first meal of the day wasn't designed to be enjoyed. It was a means to an end, a no-frills pit stop to load calories and keep going. Sitting down for this meal, you're served the essentials: a dense, gritty loaf of bread and a mug filled with something that resembles beer, but only in name. Let's start with the bread. Before you even take a bite, you'll notice right away, it's not the soft, airy kind you're probably used to. No warm rolls, no perfectly sliced toast. This is nothing more than a compact hunk of calories shaped out of emmer wheat or barley, baked until just edible. Chewing it is its own chore. Each bite requires effort, not just because of its dense texture, but because tiny, unwelcome grains of sand made their way into the mix during the grinding process. That's right, every piece of bread came with a little surprise crunch, a daily reminder of the primitive stone tools that turned kernels into flour. And that gritty, sandy texture did more than just make eating unpleasant. Over time, it wore down teeth, sometimes to the point of infection or worse. Archaeologists studying ancient remains have found Egyptian teeth ground down to stumps, thanks to meals like this repeated day after day. But hey, it gets worse. A clay oven was often used to bake the bread, which might have added to the final flavor profile, if you can call it that. These ovens were shared spaces, not pristine by any standard, with occasional uninvited guests, like rats. The good news is this surprise protein didn't usually make it into breakfast, but the poor sanitation of the preparation process didn't help in making the bread any more appetizing. The loaf you reluctantly gnaw through isn't an indulgence, it's a necessity. No one in ancient Egypt cared if you actually enjoyed it. Then there's the beer, but throw out any idea of frosty glasses or comforting pub vibes at the end of a long day. What you're drinking here is thick, cloudy, and lukewarm, more like a sloppy, half-fermented cereal soup. It's brewed from barley, but don't expect anything flavorful or refreshing. What you get tastes sour and a little funky, the result of a brewing process meant for survival rather than satisfaction. Beer packed calories and replaced the water you might avoid, because Nile water wasn't exactly clean. In fact, beer was safe because brewing killed off the kind of parasites or bacteria that could take you out faster than any sunburn or snake bite could. Kids drank it too, not for fun, but because it was safer than filling a cup straight from the river. And unlike the food options in Egypt we might romanticize, the banquets, the delicacies that filled tomb paintings, your breakfast wasn't a feast of variety. Bread and beer were more or less guaranteed. But from there, it was a mixed bag. If you were lucky, maybe an onion or a few dried dates joined the spread. The onion might make tears stream down your cheeks, but it brought a sharp, pungent flavor that would have been one of the few interesting tastes you had all week. As for dates, they offered a little natural sweetness if you weren't already tired of them. These additions weren't daily staples for everyone. They were small blessings for those who could get their hands on them. Protein, however, save the thought, unless you lived near the edge of the Nile and got lucky enough to catch a fish, you weren't seeing much of it. Even then, freshly caught fish wasn't guaranteed to last long in the heat, so eating it raw might have been the only way to enjoy it before it spoiled. Egyptians reserved meat, whether fish or otherwise, for special occasions most of the time. For breakfast, it's pretty safe to say your plate, or more accurately, your mat on the floor, is looking thin. The goal here isn't to feel full, and it certainly isn't to enjoy yourself. The job of this meal is to fuel you for the labor awaiting under the already blazing sun. Now, think about this from the perspective of someone accustomed to modern breakfasts. You might be able to stomach the bread, but the sand. One sharp crunch between your molars, and the irritation sets in. Knowing that every bite wears down your teeth makes the act of eating feel less like nutrition and more like slow-motion decay. And as for the beer, the thick, grainy consistency alone might throw you off before you ever get to the sour taste. It wasn't refreshing. At best, it was tolerable. But you'd have to drink it anyway, because there are no alternatives. Water straight from the Nile is a shortcut to parasites, and anything boiled or filtered is an idea far ahead of its time. Imagine waking up every day knowing, this is how you start. No pastries to lighten the mood. No savory breakfast to give you energy with flavor to match. Your body might adapt to the bare bones routine, but your spirit, that's another story. Sure, bread and beer did their job, and Egyptians survived on it for centuries, but the monotony of the meal underscores just how different survival in their world was. Flavor was often sacrificed for practicality, and food wasn't so much an experience as it was a transaction. Eat this, drink this, and prepare for the next 12 hours of physical exhaustion. The lack of variety wasn't unique to breakfast either. It was a recurring theme across most Egyptian diets. Meals were humble, and food served as a tool to keep the population functioning. Even in the homes of the wealthy, where variety might have been more common, the day-to-day reliance on staples like bread and beer carried through. Bread fueled workers building the pyramids. Beer refreshed farmers struggling under the sun. These two items weren't just breakfast, they were lifelines. And yet, for all the sand-filled monotony, there was something remarkable about the resilience to keep going. Imagine a childhood where beer was as ingrained in your daily life as water bottles are for us now, where biting into gritty bread was less about taste and all about necessity. Ancient Egyptians didn't have the luxury to question these things or the tools to change them. Their food anchored them, pushing them onward, regardless of how unenjoyable it might have been. Now the question is, could you stomach it? Could you sit down every day to a meal designed solely to keep you alive, knowing that every grainy bite came at the cost of your teeth? Could you replace fresh, clean water with a lukewarm mash of barley and call it breakfast? Sure, it worked for them, but our modern palates, spoiled by choice, might find it a challenge too far. Eating was about refueling and nothing else. And to someone who might open an app to have 5 cuisines delivered in 20 minutes, the simplicity could feel like a punishment. With breakfast out of the way, though, your brief reprieve is over. Your stomach may not feel particularly satisfied, but it doesn't have to. Bread, beer, and whatever extras you manage to scavenge are enough, for now. Because the real test isn't whether you can handle eating like an ancient Egyptian. It's whether you can take the next step, putting that gritty meal to work. And trust me, after this breakfast of champions, what's waiting for you isn't a desk job. It's a long, sweat-soaked grind under the scalding sun, hauling and hammering in ways your modern body isn't remotely ready for. After breakfast, barely refueled from your gritty bread and beer, it's straight to work. And let me warn you now, this isn't the kind of job you can half-heartedly shuffle through with sleepy eyes, waiting for a mid-morning coffee break. No, this is relentless, physical labor under the blazing sun, where breaks are rare, safety is non-existent, and the concept of ergonomics might as well be magic. Whether you're a farmer, a laborer, or even a woman working in ancient Egypt, the day ahead starts when the sun does and ends only when it vanishes behind the horizon. In fact, the sun wasn't just a source of heat. It was your schedule. Ra's journey across the sky dictated your hours, and you didn't question that. You couldn't. The light wasn't just a resource. It was an unflinching supervisor, always present, always pressing down on you as you worked. Farmers in particular had a special relationship with the sun, and not the relaxing kind. They were out in the muddy banks of the Nile, ankle deep in wet soil, planting crops that the entire civilization relied upon. Their tools didn't exactly scream cutting edge. Wooden plows rudely dragged by oxen, sickles with crude stone blades, and bare, aching hands were all they had to wrestle the fertile land into compliance. And fertile didn't mean soft. This was back-breaking work, bending all day while the sun continued climbing higher. When your back hurt, it wasn't a sign you should stop or rest. It was a sign you were doing your job, and you hoped you were doing it fast enough, because the overseer wasn't always patient about progress or mistakes. If you were a laborer, on the other hand, your day would have been even less forgiving. Imagine hauling stones heavier than most gym weights over gravel ramps, up inclines that climb toward pyramids or temples. Barefoot, sweaty, and with only basic cloth wrappings to protect your hands, you'd strain against ropes as the group leader barks orders, probably standing in what little shade he could find. And if the rock you were pulling happened to wobble or slip, breaking someone's foot or injuring you in the process, well, that's life. You'd get a swift lecture, maybe some insults, but don't expect pity. If your body gave out, they'd just replace you. The foreman wasn't looking for emotional conversations. He was looking for results. Speaking of results, the stakes only climbed higher if you worked on tombs. These weren't just projects. They were legacies. Every hammer swing against limestone, every chisel scraping delicate designs into burial chambers, carried a weight that went well beyond labor. You were carving eternity itself, a final resting place for the pharaoh or noble commissioning the job. Pressure didn't begin to describe it. One wrong move could ruin a piece of sacred decoration, putting you at risk of punishment, or worse. Workers sometimes whispered about the curses tied to tombs. If you weren't haunted for life, you might end up as part of the tomb itself, sealed behind stone walls alongside your mistake. The importance of precision and speed wasn't just a workplace policy, it was life or death. While men carried the heavier burdens, women's work wasn't any easier. Their days were a relentless gauntlet of tasks demanding every ounce of energy. Grinding grain was one of the most grueling chores, requiring you to kneel over a low, flat stone and push another heavy stone back and forth for hours. The process was exhausting, and for all that effort, you'd still be rewarded with sand in your flour. After all that grinding, you'd likely haul some water back from the Nile, juggle the job of weaving linen fabric, tend to children, prepare meals, and, if needed, step out to help in the fields as well. There were no breaks, because even moments of quiet came with a to-do list. If the baby fell asleep, you didn't rest. You kept working, grabbing quick bites of food on the go and swiping sweat from your face with the edge of your tunic. The idea of sitting down just to breathe? Laughable. The sun wasn't the only thing against you, though. Workplace safety standards were, let's call them, non-existent. Climbing scaffolds to construct towering temples or buildings came with a constant risk of falling. Tools were basic and unrefined, so accidents from sharp metal edges or crushed fingers weren't uncommon. Injuries weren't just painful, they were precarious. There was no workers' compensation, no OSHA inspector, no first aid kit waiting to bandage you up. If you couldn't perform, you were replaced. Simple as that. And infections could turn minor wounds into major problems. In a climate that bred bacteria faster than workers built pyramids, even a small cut could put you out of commission. Or worse. The heat, of course, made every single task worse. With the sun beating down on you all day, dehydration was a near constant threat. Water had to be rationed, and by now, you've already figured out that the Nile's water wasn't exactly sparkling clean. The sour beer you had at breakfast might be your go-to hydration later, even if it tasted like soggy bread. But slowing down to cool off or get a drink, not a great idea. Slowing down was a sign of weakness, and falling behind could mean putting the entire group at risk of not finishing a project on time. The pressure wasn't just relentless, it was crushing. There were no weekends to recharge, no unions to negotiate hours or fair treatment. When the pharaoh demanded a new temple or monument to honor the gods, the work didn't pause. Everyone knew their place in the grand system. For farmers, missing a harvest could have drought-sized consequences. For builders, lagging behind meant risking not just your job, but possibly your life. This was a society where divine order, Ma'at, was everything. If you didn't do your part, you weren't just failing your village or overseer. You were failing the gods themselves. No pressure, right? Really think about it. How long could modern you last? Could you haul a several-ton stone block under the sun with nothing but ropes and willpower? Could you grind grain for hours while kids tugged at you for attention? Could you dig your bare hands into Nile mud to make bricks, knowing it was the only way to keep food on the table? The physical toll is one thing, but the mental weight, the sheer absence of escape, is another entirely. There were no days off, no dreams of alternative careers, no clocking out when you were spent. It was relentless survival, day in and day out. If you've ever complained about air conditioning not working at your office, or about having to lift something slightly heavy, consider this. Ancient Egyptians wouldn't just scoff at your complaints, they'd envy your freedom. Their entire existence revolved around constant, grueling effort. Comfort wasn't the goal. Thriving wasn't even the goal. The goal was to keep going, because the moment you stopped, someone else would take your place. And if that doesn't make you appreciate your cushy office chair, nothing will. But why did they endure this? Why push through exhaustion, heat, and pain without rebellion? Well, it had everything to do with the system that demanded all of it, the divine authority of the Pharaoh. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a living God. Complaining about the sun, that's complaining about Ra. Questioning your workload, that's questioning the divine order of creation itself. To complain was to challenge the very reason the universe existed, or at least the reason Egyptians believed it did. And the consequences of that? We'll get into it soon. For now, just take a moment to imagine the sheer scale of what it took to survive this kind of day. You've hauled stones, ground grain, tilled muddy fields, sweated through every fibre of your tunic, and managed all of it while the sun loomed ever-present and unforgiving. Would you have lasted until sunset? Or maybe you'd give up long before that, wishing you could swap it all for a desk job you once took for granted. Either way, your day's far from over, because looming above it all is the authority that keeps this entire system running. The Pharaoh, the living God, who demands unwavering loyalty. And trust me, living under him is an entirely different kind of pressure. Complaining in ancient Egypt wasn't just unwise, it could be life-ending. The Pharaoh wasn't just another ruler in a long line of kings. To the ancient Egyptians, he was a god walking among mortals, the human embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed deity of kingship and sky. He wasn't simply enforcing laws. He was upholding the very structure of existence itself, a responsibility said to have been granted to him by the gods. The smooth functioning of the cosmos, the annual flooding of the Nile, the harvest, your livelihood, it all came back to the Pharaoh. If Ma'at, the delicate balance of truth, justice, and cosmic order was maintained, people thrived. If not, chaos, or Isfed, would descend. And if you dared to question the system, you weren't just criticizing leadership, you were defying divinity itself. The Pharaoh wasn't just one name on a throne, he was Egypt. Disobedience or dissent weren't seen as personal affronts or political disagreements. They were acts of spiritual defiance. A farmer refusing labor, a criminal withholding tribute to the Pharaoh's rule. Both threatened the precarious balance that all life depended on, and the punishments reflected that gravity. Whippings were common. Shackles stayed tight until your body gave out, and death was always an option, not as petty revenge, but as a grim reminder to the rest of Egypt about what defying their divine leader would cost. These weren't isolated cases tucked away in dark corners. They were lessons, visible and brutal, reminding everyone to stay in line. If you whisper a complaint, you better hope Ra didn't hear it. For commoners like you, the Pharaoh wasn't someone you'd see on a casual stroll through town. His palace might as well have existed in another realm, crammed with luxury, teeming with guards, and meticulously run by scribes, advisors, and priests whose schedules were filled with rituals and bureaucracy. The average Egyptian would rarely, if ever, lay eyes on the Pharaoh. He only appeared during moments designed for spectacle, like grand religious festivals, where he'd emerge far above the masses, showered in gold, and wrapped in symbols of authority. These moments weren't for bonding. They were calculated performances that kept his godlike status intact. When you saw him, it wasn't just a leader. It was the physical manifestation of Egypt's destiny, untouchable and removed from your daily struggles. Now, imagine living under that kind of power. The psychological weight of it crushed down on everything you did. Every choice you made was indirectly tied to serving not just the Pharaoh, but the whole system he represented. Your labor wasn't just backbreaking because of the physical exertion. It was mentally exhausting to live in constant deference. You served without question because the alternative wasn't just risky, it was unthinkable. And even if you did consider rebelling, the odds of success were non-existent. The resources, controlled by the pharaoh, the army, answered only to him. The courts, ruled in his name, meshing faith with statecraft. Egypt's hierarchy wasn't just a political system. It was a belief system ingrained in every aspect of life. The stress didn't end at work or in public spaces either. Even at home, in moments of supposed privacy, there was no escaping the silent pressure of living under divine rule. If a flood came late, if crops failed, or if disease spread, people wondered, was it our fault? Had we angered the gods? Or worse, had the pharaoh fallen short in his duties to maintain Ma'at? And just like that, your mind would circle back to your place in his vision. Were your offerings too small? Did you pray enough? Were you properly obedient in his eyes and in those of the gods? Nobody wanted to take a chance on becoming part of the problem. So devotions increased. Complaints disappeared into whispers, and any suggestion of disobedience was squashed before it could take hold. Now, let's pause for a moment. Take your modern mindset, one where individual liberties, free speech, and rallies for fairness are considered basic rights. Drop that into ancient Egypt and watch sparks fly. Can you imagine how quickly someone from today would crumble under such rigid control? The idea of never questioning authority, of accepting your lot without argument, feels alien to us. For Egyptians, though, it wasn't just normal, it was survival. Loyalty wasn't a choice, it was your first and only rule. Your job wasn't to dream or disrupt, it was to exist within the framework determined by people higher than you. Breaking that unspoken contract never ended well. Even if you were fully compliant, it didn't mean life was easy. The state you answered to demanded complete control over labor. If you were involved in royal construction projects, building temples or pyramids, carving statues, or decorating tombs, you weren't just a worker. You were a part of the pharaoh's legacy. The expectation was steep. You served with something resembling joy, or at least you pretended to. And if you didn't, if the pace was too slow, corners were cut, or your strength gave out, well, the punishments at your overseer's disposal were waiting. Fear was baked into daily life, ensuring compliance before people even considered rebellion. Better to fake enthusiasm than invite discipline. And yet, the pharaoh's role wasn't all threat and power. It wasn't just about issuing punishments or ordering war. A good ruler provided too. The Nile flooded on schedule? That was thanks to the pharaoh. The marketplace ran smoothly, crops were harvested, and homes were fed. Also the pharaoh. His reach wasn't just about taking. It was about ensuring the overall prosperity of the kingdom. In some ways, this duality, a ruler who could destroy you but also keep you alive, created loyalty. Fear filled in the gaps, but dependency held the system together. What's scarier than life under a pharaoh? The thought of life without one. The irony is that the pharaoh's position was both limitless in power and bound by the weight of responsibility. If the Nile didn't flood, the people whispered. If pestilence struck or armies failed in battle, they wondered. Divine connection went both ways. His duty wasn't simply ruling. He had to embody Egypt's vitality in his decisions, his actions, even his physical state. His success meant Egypt's success. His failures could send ripples of despair through every village, farm, and trading post. The balance of Ma'at might feel cosmic to you, But to the Egyptians, it rested calmly in human hands, his hands. So ask yourself, how would you live knowing your loyalty wasn't optional? That every waking moment of compliance wasn't just demanded, it was required to maintain reality itself. Forget rebellion, forget opinion, forget asking why too many times. Can you stomach the weight of thinking one wrong action or one whispered doubt could unravel everything? Imagine how rigid you'd have to be, how careful, how small in your own mind. That's not just surviving under divine authority. It's watching the pillars of your world, knowing nothing can be built without them, and nothing can fall unless it all goes with it. You don't question, you don't complain, you simply survive. Now, even if you sink into that mindset, accepting the Pharaoh as God, protector, and all-powerful ruler, there's still one thing that slips through everyone's control. One adversary you can't please, escape, or serve. Sand. It's everywhere. In your food, in your clothes, in your home. If you think the toil and submission were enough to challenge your patience, let's talk about something much smaller and far sneakier. Sand wasn't just an irritant. It was a way of life. And believe me, it didn't care about pharaohs. Sand wasn't just a fact of life in ancient Egypt. It was life. It was underfoot, blowing through the air, clinging to linen tunics, and yes, even crunching between teeth. You didn't get to avoid it. You learned to endure it. Everywhere you went, sand was there, reminding you that nature wasn't playing. And let me tell you, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the silent adversary you could never escape. Let's start with the most obvious offenders, your clothes. Egyptians wore linen, a fabric prized for being lightweight and breathable, the best option available in a climate that could roast you alive by lunchtime. But linen had one fundamental flaw. It provided about as much protection against sand as a screen door would against soup. The fine grains found their way into every fold, every seam, sticking to your skin and turning what was meant to be comfort into constant irritation. Every step would grind a little more sand against your legs, your arms, your back. Eventually, you stopped wondering if you'd ever feel clean again and just accepted the scratchy, gritty companionship. And sand didn't stop at your clothes. It was worse in your food. Take that loaf of bread you choked down for breakfast. Thanks to the primitive tools used to grind grain between stone slabs, the flour wasn't just full of wheat. It was full of tiny rock particles. Egyptians weren't just eating bread. They were eating their millstones too. The grit was unavoidable, worked directly into the dough during preparation, and baked right into the loaves. Every bite became a slow attack on your teeth, which wore down year by year. What's left in the remains of ancient Egyptians proves it. Archaeologists have found teeth ground flat, riddled with abscesses and infections from years of chewing the inescapable sand. Even if you owned every tooth-cleaning tool someone on Etsy could dream up, there'd be no saving your smile in ancient Egypt. Your dental health wasn't even a battle. You'd already lost. It gets worse when the wind picks up. Sand doesn't just stay in the ground, waiting patiently for you to interact with it. Sandstorms could turn life into a grainy exfoliation experiment no one signed up for. Hot winds would whip through towns and fields, pelting your skin, stinging your eyes, and clogging your lungs. There was no defense against it. No goggles, no masks, no indoor days. Just you and a face full of sand being carried across the land at what felt like the speed of light. Sandstorms didn't last forever, but the effects stuck around. Your skin stayed red and dry, your throat scratchy, and your patience even thinner than your protective linen tunic. With every storm, your mental checklist grew. Keep your mouth shut, squint as best you can, and just wait for it to end. Not that it helped much. Sand would still find its way into every crevice of your home, your body, and your sanity. And speaking of homes, you might think your mud brick house would provide some kind of escape. After all, you could close the door, shut the window, and let the sand blow over, right? Wrong. Mud brick walls weren't airtight fortresses. They had cracks and crevices, perfect entry points for windblown sand. And those windows, no glass. They were open holes designed to let in natural light and ventilation, which meant sand breezed in right along with it. Floors weren't immune either. The dirt would pile up invisibly until you felt the crunch beneath your bare feet. Cooking pots filled with it. Beds turned into grainy traps. Even storage jars meant to keep food clean found themselves invaded. Sand wasn't a guest in your home. It was a permanent resident, constantly sweeping it out only to have it creep right back in. That's an exhausting, unwinnable battle. And no, your feet didn't escape either. Most Egyptians went barefoot. They had no other choice. Sandals, usually made of reeds or leather, were reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. The majority walked directly on hot sand, braving the abrasive textures and searing temperatures. By the time midday rolled around, the sand underfoot could burn your soles, leaving you hopping from patch to patch for some relief. But there wasn't much reprieve to be found. The sand wore on your feet just as it wore on everything else, tearing at your skin and leaving it calloused, cracked, and vulnerable to infection. Yet another slow reminder of how the environment could grind you down day by day. Even at night, sand didn't bother to let up. You couldn't go to bed without brushing it off your mat, and even then, you weren't completely free of its presence. Sand had long since worked its way into everything. Your blanket, your mattress, your hair. And you'd wake up with traces of it still stuck to your skin. The idea of a clean start in the morning? Laughable. Long before breakfast, you had new layers of sand dusting your arms and legs, itching against yesterday's sweat that linen couldn't keep off. But while sand was annoying, it wasn't just a superficial problem. It impacted your health in ways you felt daily. Beyond the damage it did to your teeth, it also irritated your eyes and throat, courtesy of all those storms. Constant exposure to this gritty, abrasive environment left people with red, inflamed eyes, difficulty breathing, and scratchy, painful skin. It wasn't just externally draining. It was physically taxing on an ongoing basis. Every day forced you to endure it, creating a slow, grinding wear on your body over the years. Ask yourself this: how long do you think you could survive that? Would you be okay knowing sand would greet you in every meal, every breath, every patch of clothing? Could you look past the cracked feet and sore eyes long enough to keep going? Sure, our modern lives aren't perfect. Dust finds its way behind furniture. Beach trips leave sand in the car for weeks. But imagine all of that amplified 1,000 times, leaving you literally unable to ever escape it. Sand wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a constant reminder of nature's dominance. For ancient Egyptians, though, there was no choice but to deal with it. No matter how much sand disrupted life, it was woven into the environment they depended on. The same sand that invaded their houses and food surrounded the Nile, allowing the floods that made fertile soil. It was part of the tools and building materials they used to create homes, temples, and one of the most distinctive civilizations in human history. Sand was both an adversary and a resource, and that balance was simply a part of life. But for someone from today's world, The pervasive presence of sand would feel like a cruel trick. The toothpaste grit in every bite of bread, the itchy skin under linen, the literal storms of sand cutting across fields. It's not the kind of problem anyone would sit down to solve. It's the kind that would drive most people mad within days. There simply wasn't a way to get rid of it. You're not packing a vacuum. There's no hand sanitizer, no goggles to shield your eyes in storms. You take one breath of that dusty air, feel the grains on your lips, and forget everything you ever enjoyed about the desert aesthetic. And yet, as resilient as ancient Egyptians were, they lived with one constant pressure more powerful than sand itself: religion. For them, dedication to the gods shaped not just their routines, but their very understanding of why they worked so hard, endured so much, and kept going when the sand or the pharaoh seemed like enough to break anyone. Every action was steeped in ritual, a constant act of devotion to forces greater than themselves. So next, let's take a look at the invisible weight of that devotion, and how even the smallest task came with a prayer to appease the gods. Picture this: every move you make, every breath you take, and every crumb of bread you eat isn't just about survival. It's about making sure the gods are satisfied. In ancient Egypt, devotion wasn't something you saved for Sundays or occasional festivals. Faith wasn't separate from life. It was the operating system running quietly in the background of every single thing you did. Eating, bathing, working, sleeping. The gods were always watching, and keeping them pleased was as routine as pounding grain or hauling water from the Nile. Here's the thing about living in a civilization like this. The gods weren't just there to worship. They ran the whole show. Egypt didn't serve one god. It served a pantheon. There was Ra, the sun god, steering his solar boat across the sky every day so the world wouldn't plunge into chaos. Sobek, the crocodile-headed protector of the Nile, lurked beneath those murky waters you bathed in, ensuring the river stayed a lifeline instead of a liability. Thoth, with his ibis head, handled wisdom, writing, and the lunar calendar, which kept life running smoothly. Every major deity had their specific responsibilities, and each one demanded recognition. Forget about multitasking. Just keeping track of who to pray to for what could feel like balancing the universe on your shoulders. The pressure to honor the gods wasn't just spiritual. It invaded every corner of daily life. Take meal times, for example. You couldn't even start to eat until you'd offered a portion to the gods. That gritty bread, a chunk of it went to your household shrine first. The beer, same deal. It wasn't about generosity. It was an insurance policy. You were making sure the gods didn't feel neglected, because the moment you started taking those blessings for granted, your food, your health, the Nile itself, you crossed into dangerous territory. And this wasn't some symbolic exercise. Neglecting your offerings could lead to real consequences. If the crops failed or sickness swept through your home, the first question wasn't, what went wrong? It was, which god did we forget to thank? Even mundane mishaps carried weight. Stub your toe walking out the door. That wasn't just clumsiness. It could be a god giving you a warning. Or, worse, a spirit messing with you because you hadn't shown them the proper respect. A quick apology or offering was the bare minimum to get through the day, without even more bad luck piling on. Egyptians weren't leaving anything to chance, which is why temples and shrines dotted the landscape, acting as checkpoints for constant, careful devotion. Some were grand, state-run operations buzzing with priests and rituals. Others were modest, little alcoves in a home where regular folks carved out space for statues and prayers. Either way, ignoring them wasn't an option. Of course, those temples weren't just symbols of faith. They were a hub for almost every aspect of Egyptian life. Priests didn't just perform elaborate ceremonies or ensure sacrifices were up to standard. They acted as intermediaries, connecting everyday people with the divine. Need a particularly complicated prayer handled? Maybe Sobek's been looking the other way lately, and your well water's running low. You'd head to the temple, hand over an offering, and let the priests take care of the rest. But while priests had a crucial job, their power wasn't exactly equal to the gods they served. They were like managers keeping the workplace running smoothly, not the CEOs, but responsible for making sure the higher-ups stayed happy. The rituals themselves could feel overwhelming. From sunrise to sunset, Egypt ticked by on cosmic time, and maintaining Ma'at, the divine balance, was a full-time commitment. Everything tied back to this essential order of the universe. If Ra could steer his sunboat without trouble, if the Nile flooded on schedule, if crops grew and lives prospered, it meant Ma'at was intact. Everyone had a part to play, even in the smallest of tasks. Before bed, you'd send out a quick prayer, asking for protection while you slept. That wasn't just superstition. It was a plea to keep Set, the god of chaos, from invading your dreams and wreaking havoc through the night. Before heading out to work, a quick word to Ta, the craftsman god, might keep your tools from breaking or your hands from slipping in the heat. Every little action had its deity, and with it, an invisible checklist of rituals you had to mentally run through before moving on to the next task. Not keeping up with these practices didn't just feel lazy, it felt dangerous. Egyptians believed the gods were actively involved in their lives, and if they slacked on their devotion, they worried those gods would turn the other way. And when chaos loomed as the punishment for neglecting Ma'at, you didn't take chances. Even if you felt drained by the constant cycle of rituals, there was no complaining. No one grumbled about how unfair it seemed that Ra didn't give you one day off from scorching heat, or that Sobek didn't seem too worried about his worshippers getting eaten by crocodiles. They understood that this exhausting system wasn't optional. It was woven into existence itself. What's fascinating is how deeply faith shaped their perspective on everything, even the hardest parts of their lives. You'd think being bound to these rituals would feel suffocating, but many Egyptians viewed it as comforting. They didn't see life's struggles as random or chaotic. They believed that by following the rules, honoring the gods, and keeping their rituals intact, they could push back against disorder and carve out some small corner of balance in their world. Even the tough times, like poor harvests or illness, didn't necessarily break that faith. Instead, it reinforced their need to prove devotion, to show the gods they hadn't given up. Of course, it helped that wealthier Egyptians had ways of outsourcing their piety. Temples funded by the elite hauled in massive offerings, with priests handling complex rituals, while the donors reaped the benefits. Or at least, that's what they believed. It wasn't just about generosity. It was a transaction, a way of securing blessings for today and the afterlife to come. For the commoners, though, cutting corners on offerings wasn't an option. A simple plate of figs or a slice of bread often had to double as both a meal and a spiritual safeguard. Faith was not just an expression of belief. It was a survival tool. Ask yourself, how would you handle this kind of pressure? Imagine living under the constant eyes of the divine, feeling like every moment needed to prove your worth. Forget skipping rituals because you were tired, or eating a meal without giving a portion first. Every choice carried meaning, every missed prayer a possible domino toward disaster. For someone waking up in today's modern world, accustomed to independence and inner freedom, Living under this system might feel like being stuck in spiritual quicksand. Would you have the resolve to keep going? Would your uncertainty crack the delicate balance Egyptians held so tightly? But for them, there was no pause button, no stop and think moment to question it all. The rituals weren't an interruption. They were the rhythm of life. Faith wasn't separate. It was ingrained in every action, every decision, every moment of existence. And if you thought the daily grind of working, eating, and pleasing the gods was stressful, just wait until the end of your life. As tough as it was keeping up with earthly rituals, the ultimate test came after death, when judgment awaited, and even in the safety of eternity, the paperwork never really ended. Death wasn't the end for ancient Egyptians. It was more like the beginning of the longest paperwork trail you can imagine. Sure, your heart might have stopped and your body gone cold, but the real journey was just getting started. The underworld wasn't some seamless elevator ride to paradise. No, it was a bureaucratic maze, complete with checkpoints, soul testers, and even a very real chance of eternal destruction. To reach paradise, the field of reeds, you had to prove yourself worthy, step by careful step, trial by trial. At the center of this journey was Ma'at, the divine force of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. Ma'at wasn't just a concept. It was the glue holding the universe together. Upholding Ma'at during your life, through how you treated others, how you worked, how you prayed, was your ticket to having a chance at the afterlife. But dying with a good track record wasn't enough to secure eternal peace. You couldn't just take someone's word for it. The gods had to weigh in, literally. The real test went down in the Hall of Ma'at, where your soul faced judgment. Imagine this. Your spirit gets led in by Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death, who's here to play both a shepherd and an examiner. You stand before a tribunal of 42 gods, each representing a law you were supposed to uphold in life. But no one's asking yes or no questions here. Instead, you recite what's called the negative confessions. Basically, a laundry list of sins you're claiming not to have committed. I did not lie. I did not steal. I did not covet my neighbor's donkey. You had to say this to each deity in turn, with no stuttering or second guessing, because any hesitation might look suspicious. And if you think that sounds nerve-wracking, just wait. This was just the warm-up act for the main event. At the center of this courtroom drama was the heart-weighing ceremony. Your heart, considered the seat of your soul, and the record-keeper of every thought and deed in life, was placed on a set of golden scales. On the opposite side of the scale, the feather of Ma'at, symbolizing absolute purity and truth. This wasn't a figurative weighing. It was an actual test of your morality. If your heart balanced perfectly with the feather, congrats. You were deemed virtuous and allowed to continue your journey. But if it tipped the scale, proving your heart was heavy with sin, you had a serious problem. Enter Amit. She wasn't just a creature of nightmares. She was the final hurdle, and frankly, the ultimate threat in the underworld. Amit had the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the back legs of a hippo, a Frankenstein mix of Egypt's deadliest animals. Her job was straightforward: devour any heart that failed the test, and with it, the soul attached to that heart disappeared into eternal non-existence, obliterated forever. It wasn't fire or torment they feared. It was the total loss of identity, memory, and existence. And to a culture obsessed with the permanence of the soul, this was the ultimate punishment. But before you even got to this judgment scene, preparations for the afterlife started long before your final breath. Egyptians didn't approach death casually. They poured time, energy, and ridiculous amounts of money into making sure their journey through the underworld went as smoothly as possible. For the wealthy, it often meant commissioning elaborate tombs, decorated top to bottom with scenes from life, pleas to the gods, and protective spells. These tombs weren't just places for the body, they were vehicles for the soul, equipped with everything a person might need to navigate the afterlife. What went into the tomb depended on your status and wealth, of course. The basics included food offerings, perfumes, tools, jewelry, and clothing, things that symbolize comfort in the next world. But one of the most interesting additions was the Shakti. These small, doll-like figures were meant to act as servants in the afterlife. They'd handle all the hard work for you, farming, building, day-to-day chores, essentially sparing you from the gritty, exhausting existence of daily labor. If you had the money to commission an army of them, congratulations. You just bought yourself an afterlife upgrade. If you couldn't afford Shaktis, well, maybe you'd wish you could afford a do-over when you got to the other side. The most critical item, however, was a copy of what we call the Book of the Dead. It wasn't a single book, mind you, but more like a collection of spells, prayers, and detailed instructions designed to guide you through the underworld. Think of it as the ultimate travel guide. It told you which passwords to use at gates, which spells to dodge demons, and even what to say to particular gods to get on their good side. One spell might help you get past rivers of fire. Another might grant you safe passage across dangerous roads. Forget to pack it. Or worse, couldn't afford to have one. Too bad. The underworld didn't come with a customer service desk. But even in death, ancient Egyptians had one lingering anxiety: tomb robbers. The tombs filled with treasures and carefully prepared artifacts were magnets for thieves. Gold amulets, jewelry, even the mummies themselves were targets. Grave robbing wasn't just a modern fascination with Egypt. It was a full-on industry back then. And if your tomb was looted, it wasn't just an earthly loss. You needed those items to make it through the afterlife. Without them, your chances of reaching the field of reeds dropped dramatically. Losing your burial goods could feel like someone shredding your passport on the way to the airport. So, tombs weren't just designed to be beautiful. They were fortified too, complete with curses and traps to deter thieves. And those who got caught stealing from the dead faced brutal punishments: beatings, mutilation, exile, or simply death. Sometimes they ended up buried as punishment themselves, though likely without all the fancy afterlife gear they had stolen. For the lucky, well-prepared souls who managed to get through the underworld unscathed, the reward was worth the struggle. The field of reeds wasn't some otherworldly, abstract paradise. It was Egypt, but better. The same fields, the same blue skies, but without sandstorms, without labor, without hunger or heartbreak. Crops grew effortlessly, boats glided on perfect waters. Your family, if they'd made it through their own underworld journey, would join you. It was a version of life with the struggles stripped away, a vision that likely made all the religious devotion, rituals, and preparation feel worthwhile. But here's the catch. Getting there wasn't random. It took more planning than most of us put into our actual lives. You needed a good reputation, a well-prepared tomb, all the right funerary goods, and, ideally, money. Plenty of it. If you were poor, the chances of skipping any steps only added to the unpredictability. You might cling to hope that the gods would take pity, or that communal rituals by your family could help level the playing field. But let's be honest, having wealth didn't hurt your chances of eternal peace. And even after all this effort, you had to rely on your own soul to succeed in those final, terrifying tests. So here's the question. Could you handle it? Could you have lived a life devoted to preparing, knowing that one misstep, one heavy heart, one missing spell, one greedy grave robber could undo all of it? For ancient Egyptians, the stakes weren't just about living well. It was about living forever. Death wasn't just scary. It was high-stakes bureaucracy. Even modern you, with your supposed knowledge and technology, might struggle to keep your soul intact with all those rules, rituals, and obstacles in place. And if you're wondering why so much effort went into preparing for this journey, it's because they didn't view life and death as two separate things. They were part of the same cosmic cycle, connected through Mahat. Every action, every ritual, every piece of bread offered to a lingering shadow built toward this moment. And yet somehow they carried all this weight through the heat, the toil, the sand, and the fear of judgment. And the fact that they survived, thrived, and built a culture that endured for thousands of years is, honestly, incredible. But how did they do it? How did they handle the relentless demands of their world and create something so timeless? Let's talk about that next. Despite everything you've heard so far, sandstorms, sunburn, crocodile-dodging mornings, and bread that slowly destroyed your teeth, the ancient Egyptians didn't just endure. They thrived. Their civilization lasted for over 3,000 years. Think about that. 3,000. Longer than most of us can fathom. So how did they pull it off? How did they manage to not only survive in such unforgiving conditions, but actually build one of the most iconic civilizations in history? The short answer is, they were incredibly adaptable, deeply resourceful, and, let's be honest, a little obsessed with planning ahead. For one thing, their relationship with the Nile was nothing short of genius. Some people might look at a river like that and just see a place to fish or bathe, or maybe avoid because of the whole crocodile situation. But the Egyptians saw potential. They didn't just let the Nile do its thing. They engineered their entire civilization around its seasonal floods. This was a society that depended on a very specific rhythm. When the river flooded, it coated the land with rich, fertile silt. They called it the gift of the Nile. But let's not pretend it all just happened naturally. The Egyptians worked hard to control this gift. They built irrigation systems to distribute water far from the riverbanks, turning the desert into farmland and guaranteeing food for their growing population. These irrigation channels might not look impressive compared to modern plumbing, but they were vital. No Nile, no crops. No crops, no civilization. It's that simple. And they didn't just stop at managing the floods. They recorded its patterns, tracked its behavior, and planned for years when things didn't go quite as expected. Modern farmers with weather apps could learn a thing or two from how they handled it. That's not all, though. Food security wasn't just about planting barley and hoping Ra gave you enough sun. They took things further by organizing labor in ways that made massive projects possible. The surplus food from those fertile fields allowed them to free up part of the population for specialized work. Imagine that. You've just harvested enough wheat to last through the season. So suddenly someone has the time to chisel a 300-foot sphinx out of rock or paint intricate hieroglyphs onto tomb walls. And if you're picturing teams of government bureaucrats with clipboards, well, you're not far off. Egyptians were kings of organization. The pharaoh at the top delegated power to nobles and priests, who delegated to scribes who, believe it or not, were Egypt's equivalent of accountants. These guys tracked everything: grain inventories, workforce rosters, trading transactions, and made sure the wheels of society turned smoothly. And their inventions didn't stop at farming and project management. They had a surprisingly advanced grasp of medicine for their time. Sure, there was a lot of magical thinking mixed in. Spells and prayers often got mixed with treatments, like when they'd chant over honey to make it more sacred before rubbing it onto wounds. But let's not scoff too quickly. They were onto something there. Honey has natural antibacterial properties, and they combined this with something else shockingly modern. They packed wounds with moldy bread, which sounds disgusting, until you realize mold contains penicillin-like properties that helped prevent infections. They even had surgical tools, stone knives, hooks, and saws, and they knew enough about anatomy to perform basic surgeries. Was it perfect? Number. But when you consider they were doing this thousands of years before microscopes or germ theory, it's honestly impressive that anyone lived long enough to worship another day. Their sense of resilience didn't only come from their practicality, though. It's hard to overstate how much their faith kept them going. The gods, the rituals, the afterlife. It wasn't just religion. It was a full-on worldview. Picture living in a time and place where everything had meaning. A bad crop wasn't just bad luck. It was a warning that maybe you'd fallen out of step with Ma'at. And Ma'at wasn't just balance in some abstract sense. It was an all-encompassing cosmic truth. It shaped their laws, their roles in society, even their daily chores. And knowing that if you followed the rules, you could keep chaos, or as they called it, Isfet, at bay. That gave people a sense of purpose. Even when they were sweating through relentless heat or digging fields with aching limbs, they knew it was part of something bigger. What's fascinating is how their faith evolved right alongside their culture. Over thousands of years, their religious practices didn't stay rigid. Instead, they adapted to suit the times. Early on, their gods were tied to local areas. Different regions worshipped different deities, like Hathor in one place or Sobek in another. As their kingdom expanded and unified under the pharaohs, so did their religion. Over time, smaller gods were absorbed into larger traditions to solidify a shared identity. Even their views on the afterlife changed. Early on, eternal life was something only pharaohs and nobility reached for. By later periods, even ordinary farmers believed they had a shot at the field of reeds if they lived an honorable life and could pay for proper burial preparations. It was inclusive evolution, not because someone declared it should be, but because their beliefs adapted under changing circumstances. Speaking of adaptability, they didn't just adjust spiritually. Ancient Egyptians faced down invaders, droughts, and internal conflict. And still, they didn't collapse. Sure, their society had its challenges. Power shifted between dynasties. The Nile wasn't always as reliable as they hoped. And foreign enemies occasionally tested their boundaries. But even here, their resourcefulness showed. Egypt's culture thrived because it absorbed influences instead of resisting them. They adopted new technologies, trade goods, and even military practices from neighboring cultures. Yes, they relied heavily on tradition, but when it came to their survival, they were smart about blending old ways with new ideas. Let's not forget one of their strongest features, community. None of this, irrigation, construction, worship, preparation for the afterlife, would have worked without a society that valued cooperation. The shared experience of farming the land, working on massive state projects, or participating in festivals wasn't just practicality, it created bonds. When everyone depended on the same Nile, the same gods, and the same cycles of nature, you weren't just surviving for yourself, you were part of something larger. Even daily struggles, like grinding grain or pulling stones up ramps, were softened by the fact that people did it together. That collective resilience that willingness to shoulder the load side by side, kept their culture going for centuries longer than most civilizations could dream of. Now, here's the part that really forces you to think. They achieved all this. Order from chaos, beauty from barren land, with no modern technology, no electricity, no fossil fuels, nothing but their hands, their ingenuity, and their collective will. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy. And yet, they left behind monuments so perfect that modern architects are still arguing over how they pulled it off. They built libraries of knowledge encoded into stone walls and left clues about who they were, even if much of their daily grind has been lost to time. If there's one thing to take from ancient Egypt, it's this. Survival isn't just about endurance. It's about adaptability, community, and a shared belief in something greater than yourself. Could modern you survive under a pharaoh's rule? Maybe not. But ancient Egyptians didn't just survive. They thrived. They made the unbearable seem ordinary, the impossible seem achievable, and along the way, carved an enduring legacy deep into the sands of history. And now, after walking through a day in their sandals, or bare feet, more likely, it's time to appreciate what they endured. From sun-soaked fields to gritty bread, to their relentless pursuit of balance, they remind us what humans are capable of. So as we step out of the past and back into our air-conditioned present, let's carry a little bit of their resilience with us, if only to make the next Monday morning feel a little easier. Surviving a single day in ancient Egypt wasn't about beauty or grandeur. It was survival in its rawest form. The relentless heat, grit in everything from your bread to your bed, and the constant weight of divine and social expectations turned every moment into a test of endurance. And yet, they thrived. Their achievements, carved into stone and memory, remain a testament to their resilience. It's a stark reminder. While you're sipping cool water from a tap or scrolling on your phone, those simple comforts are luxuries they couldn't imagine. If this journey left you curious, join me next time as we explore another era.